In today's video, we're going to be responding to two of Cameron's recent videos on his channel, Capturing Christianity, about why he doesn't take atheism seriously. When I saw these videos, I had a bit of reservations, and upon reading and watching some of the responses that people like Joe Schmidt has made on to these videos, I thought, well, I might chime in to this debate and tell you why I'm so concerned about the direction in which Christian YouTube is going. And I just feel that Cameron's two videos summarize these growing concerns I've already had for quite some time. This video is going to be structured very simply. I'm going to start off by watching and responding directly to the two videos, and then I am going to get into some more broader contextual and broader meta-analysis of why this problem occurs, why this might be happening, giving Cameron the benefit of the doubt, and also talk about why there are dangers in this approach. So without further ado, let's get right into it. I've put this on 2x speed just to get through this quickly because we have around 40 minutes of actual video to go through.
Roughly 13 years ago, my brother became an atheist. We were brought up non-denominational, evangelical Christians, so this came as quite a shock, as you might imagine. Now, I actually went through my own period of doubt right after high school, but I got over it pretty quickly. Like, I personally doubted whether or not Jesus actually existed, but I had those doubts overcome pretty quickly when I learned that Jesus was actually mentioned by non-Christian historians like Josephus. So after I learned that he became an atheist, I thought I could overcome his doubts pretty easily, but I was wrong. I was very, very wrong. After I learned that my brother became an atheist, I decided I was going to meet with him and like crush all his objections. Okay, this ended up being like the worst idea that I could have come up with. My brother and I met, and it turned out to be literally like one of the worst nights of my life. He raised objections to Christianity I had never even dreamt of, but that night showed me that I really had no clue why I believed in Christianity. So after that night, I started to look into the arguments for and against God's existence. I wanted to know whether or not God's existence was actually reasonable. And after just a few weeks of study, I quickly learned that there are very powerful arguments for God's existence. I found the Kalam cosmological argument, contingency arguments, teleological arguments from fine-tuning, arguments from consciousness, moral arguments, and so on. Like there's actually a ton of arguments for the existence of God. Check out this video, got it linked right here, in which we lay out over 150 arguments for God's existence that show up in the literature.
Now, this is a very heartfelt story. I think a lot of people who grow up in the church especially often experience people who they're close to fall away from faith, and that can be a very shaking movement. I have good friends who've seen their brothers fall away of faith, especially when there is that existential, that soteriological implication to losing one's faith that could really shake one's heart, especially when people are providing a lot of rational belief. Especially in the evangelical context, a lot of people who are growing up with Christianity don't get taught apologetics, they get taught the scriptures and how to live their life, which are fundamentally two different fields. And that is not a criticism of the church. It is more important for us to actually understand how to live a Christian life than to think about, okay, how valid is a Kalam cosmological argument? How valid is a modal ontological argument? If a pastor went out on a Sunday and said, okay, S5 logic means if something's possibly necessary, then that thing is necessarily necessary, everyone would probably throw stones at said pastor and leave the sermon because they'd be like, this is not what we're here for. So it's not necessarily the fault of the Christianity to lead, or which leads people to be unprepared to deal with these challenges. And as a result, what Cameron experienced about someone losing their faith because they perhaps read something like Richard Dawkins' A God Delusion, or they've read some arguments online or watched some YouTube videos online, they leave their faith because of these arguments, then it can lead to a shock because people are not expected to be able to respond to them, and they're not prepared to be able to respond to these arguments. Now, of course, then Cameron raises the flip side. He then looks at the arguments for the existence of God and then says, okay, there's loads of arguments, let's read into them, and finds them very convincing. Once again, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. Someone could leave their faith very easily because they haven't really delved into the arguments, and then they get shocked by opposing viewpoints. And then in reaction to that, someone goes onto the other side of the internet and then finds a lot of good arguments for the existence of God, and then becomes very strongly convinced in them. That is basic psychology. It's very easy, and I'm not saying this is confirmation bias and then make an argument ad hominem to say, oh, as long as you're trying to defend your own position, you're going to think you're very smart and think you're going to have very good arguments. But I do think confirmation bias does fall into this position where you're like, well, oh, I need some arguments. I found some good arguments. Okay, these are very, very strong arguments. Let's dismiss all the opposing forces or all the opposing arguments on the other side. That's what I see with a lot of friends when people come to me and say, well, all right, Josh, I know you're studying philosophy and theology at Oxford. I want some help. Someone's giving me an argument from the problem of evil. I'll give them a short summary of some theodicies, some responses to that. And then they'll go away and say, oh my gosh, I have so many good arguments against atheists. Or likewise, do we have any existence from God? I give them a Kalam cosmological argument. I give them a fine-tuning argument. And all of a sudden, they're like, wow, we have so many arguments for the existence of God. These are so good. But then I often try to tell them to say, hold on to a second. Of course, if you're coming from a perspective of a philosophical layman, then whatever arguments that us philosophers have been doing in our ivory towers for our whole lives, William Lane Craig, Andrew Locke, loads of these people making arguments of course, from a philosophical layman, you're going to think, oh, these arguments are amazing, both for the atheist and the theistic side. So I think what Cameron, or at least what someone has to do when they're developing in this path of either challenging Christianity or challenging atheism, they have to have a bit of an epistemic humility to say, well, hold up a second, I should probably try to look at this from a very balanced perspective to say, well, maybe just because I think these arguments are very convincing, let me not try to jump the gun and say, oh my gosh, this is life-changing, these are amazing arguments. They might be amazing arguments, but let's try not to let our confirmation bias influence that. And also on another side, when Cameron says, I have 150 arguments for the existence of God, let's face it, a lot of these are minute differences of similar arguments. They're not new arguments. It's not like, oh, there's cosmological arguments, fine-tuning arguments, narrative arguments for the existence of God, and all of a sudden there's like 150 of these different categories. It probably is more like there are cosmological arguments under which there's maybe 5 or 6 of them which can be presented and are held to be very strong, and then further variations and tweaks on each one of them. So when someone watches this video, it's very tempting to say, oh, I have a very clickbaity, very strong argument to say, do you know what? There's actually 150 arguments for God. Probably let's not jump the gun on that. Let's be a bit more humble from that perspective.
Atheism. Now, the best argument that atheists have, at least that I found, is the problem of evil. The problem of evil is so powerful, in fact, that it's led a lot of people to say, look, okay, sure, you've got arguments for the existence of God, but the problem of evil is so powerful that it defeats all of those arguments. But you know what? I should probably pause the story really quickly and just explain what this argument is, just a little bit more in depth, because somewhat counterintuitively, it actually plays a central role in why I no longer take atheism seriously. So first, let me say that this is one of the arguments I've paid the most attention to over the past decade. I've read books, I've watched debates between top scholars, I've listened to lectures, I've watched Joe Schmidt, and so on. So to quickly summarize, the problem of evil is an argument against an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good God. There's a really common way that it's expressed these days. Premise 1, if God exists, pointless suffering does not exist. Premise 2, pointless suffering exists. Therefore, 3, conclusion, God does not exist.
So just to say, it's good that he is recognizing the problem of evil. I think the problem of evil, and of course the problem of divine hiddenness by Schellenberg, it is a bit of a development of the problem of evil. I think it is the strongest. These two things are the strongest arguments against theism. So it's good that Cameron is noting them, and that it's good that he is, as I was saying just now, he is engaging with opposing views and opposing ideas, and that's a very important thing as well to keep in mind.
Both premises in this argument seem pretty plausible. Like, if God did exist, he would probably not permit any pointless suffering. All suffering would have some kind of purpose. The Bible even says that God is working all things toward our good. So premise 1 seems pretty plausible. Premise 2 also seems pretty plausible. Like, just look around a bit and you'll find cases of seemingly pointless suffering. Now, as you might expect, just like atheists have responses to the arguments for God's existence, Christians have responses to both premises and the argument from evil. Some Christians argue that God can allow pointless suffering. Others argue that while some suffering might seem pointless on the surface, it still nevertheless has a purpose. But that's not what I'm doing in this video. Like, I wasn't convinced that atheism is silly because Christians have responses to these premises. The reason why I don't take atheism seriously any longer is because even if we accept the atheist's strongest argument, it still wouldn't prove atheism. And now I'm kind of realizing that I probably should have defined atheism a lot earlier on. But philosophically, atheism is the view that there are no gods. It's very simple. There's no creator, there's no designer of the universe. We weren't created for some purpose by somebody. Theism, on the other hand, is the view that at least one God exists. So atheism has no gods and theism has at least one God. But so why doesn't the problem of evil establish atheism? Well, simply because there are many other kinds of gods that it doesn't rule out. The British philosopher Philip Goff is a really good example of someone that adopts a sort of non-standard view of God.
So we're in a situation where the believers are tying themselves up in knots trying to explain suffering, the atheists are trying to tie themselves up in knots trying to explain fine-tuning, when in fact, there are middle ground options that can elegantly account for both of these data points. Consider, for example, the hypothesis of a God of limited power. A God who's made the best universe they can. Maybe God simply can't create complex life in an instant. Maybe the only way God can create intelligent life is by creating a universe with the right physics that is eventually going to evolve intelligent life. And God's like, I'm sorry, I know it's going to be messy. This is all I can do. Is this or nothing? I think this hypothesis can account for both the fine-tuning in terms of God's purposes and the suffering in terms of God's limitations.
So even though God is all good, perfectly benevolent on this view, given his limit in power, there's no way that he can stop all of the suffering in the world. What I want you to notice here, and this is really important, the problem of evil, once again, one of the atheist's best arguments, doesn't touch this particular view of God that we just went over. Like, it doesn't touch it at all. Think about it like this. Okay, scientists used to believe that the speed of light was infinite. When we discovered evidence that the speed of light was finite instead of infinite, we didn't conclude that there's no such thing as light, right? We modified our concept of the speed of light, one of the properties of light. So what I'm saying here is that the best case scenario for the atheist in this argument should really just lead us to revise our view of God. It shouldn't lead us to become atheists. Keep in mind, I'm not saying that the problem of evil is sound or persuasive per se.
Now, this is a very interesting suggestion. He is indeed raising the idea of anthropodicee, which is an idea raised by Roth and a few people in a helpful book called Encountering Evil, which is edited by Stephen Davis. It is a very interesting work that I would recommend you to read, which covers some of the different theodicies, and anthropodicee is one of them, which says, well, okay, instead of let's trying to figure out what God is and start with God and evil and try to analyze them, let's start with evil and then understand what God is in light of that evil. Now, that's all well and good in a philosophical landscape. However, when we're saying, well, this should lead us to not take atheism seriously, that, I think, is a leap in judgment, because when you're talking to the everyday Christian, they would say that any idea against what people may call a perfect being theology, or a perfect idea of omniscience, omnipotence, and omnipresence, this idea of the classical theism, people would say, well, hold up a second, you're no longer talking about Christianity. Now, whether the actual language used here is correct, and Wittgenstein talks a lot about this, or at least Wittgensteinian philosophers like D.Z. Phillips touched a lot about actually what do we mean when we're using these words like omnipotence, omniscience, what is the language game, what's the context in which we're talking about God. So now that's a different debate, right? I want to put that aside. What we do need to think about is, well, hold up a second. Yes, it might not mean that the belief that there is no gods is guaranteed by the problem of evil, but if most Christians come into the problem of evil and come into Christianity with the conception of a certain idea of God, let's just say the Christian God, for example, and if the problem of evil defeats that idea and says, well, hold up a second, you need to present or defend a limited formula of that God, or at least that the success of the problem of evil would mean or imply that the Christian God's wrong and that we should accept a limited thesis about what God is like, maybe like what Philip Goff is saying about, okay, he might not be infinite powerful, the idea of goodness might be different, which people like D.Z. Phillips would try to allow us to accept as religious believers, then, well, the conclusion of that would be, hold up a second, the Christian God is no longer true. And for a Christian philosopher, a Christian YouTuber, then surely he should still take the problem of atheism seriously, because yes, it might be the case that it doesn't mean that atheism is correct, but it also is the case, if the problem of evil is correct, that Christian theism, at least defined by most people, is also incorrect. So a Christian theist would say, well, the atheist argument from the problem of evil would, even if it doesn't mean that atheism is true, would also mean Christian theism is not true, and that would lead to significant problems.
So I think there are many good responses to the problem of evil, like the soul-building theology. I'm saying that even if we grant it, hypothetically, if we grant it, it doesn't come anywhere close to even establishing atheism. Something else important I want you to notice is that the same cannot be said of arguments for God's existence. Like if we grant that the arguments go through for God's existence, then they would actually prove that at least one God is real. So the move that I'm making here by like hypothetically granting their argument is not available to the atheists. They can't hypothetically grant the arguments for theism. Instead, they just sort of have to trust that every argument for God's existence fails, even the ones they've never heard of, which is actually kind of a giant leap of faith if you think about it. All right, now just so I'm not misunderstood, here's what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that
Now, that is a very interesting idea. He says, well, okay, the arguments for the existence of God is equal, or the arguments for the existence of God does lead to the existence of God, whereas the problem of evil doesn't necessarily lead to atheism. I would like to make the suggestion, and this is from my reading of natural theology, I want to make it very clear that my focus on arguments for the existence of God is not my research interest. I focus a lot on the problem of evil and on continental philosophy, so I'm not an expert on arguments for the existence of God. That being said, from my understanding of these arguments for the existence of God, once again, the arguments are very rarely, apart from the argument from the resurrection, a direct reference to the God of Christian theism. Yes, it could be an argument for some metaphysical being, but it does not necessarily entail an all-perfect, all-loving, all-good being. So, for example, the argument from the cosmological argument, the God from that might not be the same God that the problem of evil is arguing against. So in some sense, you could say, well, someone can grant the problem of evil while also granting the cosmological argument, because the problem of evil just says, if God is all good, then evil cannot exist. The cosmological argument, if true, would say a God might exist, or a supernatural cause of the universe exists. But that supernatural cause of the universe could be good, amoral, ambivalent to the goodness in the world, ambivalent to the evil in the world, or is the cause might be evil. So you can see that Cameron's kind of reasoning here, I don't think really jumps from, oh, as long as we grant at least any one of these arguments for the existence of God, then that means God must exist. Well, we need to be very clear about what God means, and we also need to be very clear about what actually are we arguing for, and why should we not take atheism seriously? Because just as I've said just now, that, okay, the atheist argument does not necessarily prove that there is no God. It might just leave us with a limited theist or limited deity. Well, the arguments of God may also lead us to a limited deity, which is unrecognizable by most Christian believers, which, if you take it back to his original discussion with his brother might look at the situation and say, well, hold up a second. Okay, I grant all your objections here. I grant this whole video, but I still decide not to be a Christian. And then it would seem like they've gotten back to square one, where the brother, although has now granted all the discussions and arguments that Cameron's given, has said, well, I'm still not a Christian. I might believe in some God, but I'm not a Christian anyways.
Power. I'm not saying that we have to make this move, okay? What I'm saying is that the atheist's best argument doesn't come close to establishing atheism. Not even close. So even if we grant the atheist's strongest argument, it does not support atheism. The most it would do, again, hypothetically, is cause us to revise our view of God. That's it. And this is a huge reason why I no longer take atheism seriously. I should also mention that this is just one reason why I no longer take atheism seriously. If you'd like to see more reasons, check out my recent live stream with David Wood, where we break down Alex O'Connor's embarrassing debate against Cliff Netchell. So it appears that David Wood and I are actually in complete agreement on this, which is pretty cool. Oh, and then Christianity is true.
Well, okay, I would not touch David Wood's argument. Though that being said, I have to say the title of that video, let me get it
Embarrassing.
up. Alex O'Connor's embarrassing debate. That is also another small point of why I've gotten rather disillusioned with Christian YouTube, because, you know, you wouldn't find that necessarily in academic or respectful dialogue. I've met Alex O'Connor once. He's a very nice guy. I've watched some of his videos more recently, and he's a very respectable person. In fact, I think out of all the atheist thinkers or atheist YouTubers on, not atheist thinkers, but atheist YouTubers on the platform, he is one of the people who takes Christianity the most serious, and I think he has the most goodwill. So I have great respect for him. So to call the guy embarrassing here, or call this video embarrassing, does seem to be a bit of a stretch when it comes to nice, I guess, pleasantries in philosophical debate. Now, in awareness of time, I'll pop to his other video, which I also want to read, why atheism is silly. But I just hope that just going through his first video,
quite frankly,
will show you some of the concerns I have with him saying, "Oh, let's not take atheism seriously," because, well, yes, I think we should still take atheism very seriously, because if his whole argument, I guess the narrative of his video, was to kind of respond to his brother, as I've said previously, I don't necessarily think that his brother is going to be very convinced by what he has said.
Yep.
I'll recommend you, just before we get into it, to watch Joe Schmidt and Matthew Adelstein's video on Majesty of Reason. That channel, they do a 2-hour breakdown of this video. I'm not going to do a 2-hour breakdown of this video. I'm just going to watch it and give you some of my thoughts, just as I've done with the first video, because I don't want to make this too much of a philosophical response. I'm more concerned about how these two videos represent the downfall or the going bad of Christian YouTube.
I'm a little bit sick right now, so if I sound congested, just bear with me. All right, so here's what makes this video unique. Okay, I'm not just going to talk at you about philosophy. I want to bring math to the table. So using probability theory and some awesome, amazing new software that I built over Christmas. Yes, I code on my holidays. I'll visually demonstrate why atheism is non-serious. And don't worry, you don't need a PhD in math to follow along with this video. The software is going to make it super easy to follow. And I promise it's actually going to blow your mind. Like, this video has the potential to skyrocket your level of credence in the existence of God. Before we dive into the good stuff of this video, let me just quickly recap the main point of my last video, because some folks unsurprisingly misunderstood what my point was. Here's what I said. Okay, even if we grant atheism's so-called best argument, the problem of evil, it still does not prove atheism is true. At best, it might challenge the idea that the creator is all-powerful or morally perfect, but it doesn't establish that the creator doesn't exist. Now, let me clear up another big misconception. When I say I no longer take atheism seriously, what I mean is that I no longer take it as a serious contender to theism. Some people think that the problem of evil makes atheism more likely than theism, or that it's some kind of like theism destroying trump card. Let me be blunt. That is obviously false. The existence of evil doesn't magically make atheism the most reasonable explanation of reality. So in this video,
well, now I'll also like to say that I do agree with his statement here.
Some people think that the problem of evil makes atheism more likely than all-powerful or morally perfect. Let's quickly recap the main point of my last video, because some folks unsurprisingly misunderstood what my point was. Here's what I said. Okay, even if we grant atheism's so-called best argument, the problem of evil, it still does not prove atheism is true. At best, it might challenge the idea that the creator is all-powerful or morally perfect, but it doesn't establish that the creator doesn't exist. Let me clear up.
No, that I agree with. I do think that the problem of evil, even if it is successful, doesn't necessarily deny the existence of any theists. And I don't think that's what the atheist is arguing either. I don't think the atheist, when they're presenting the problem of evil, is saying, well, all right, let's think about J.L. Mackie when he presents a logical problem of evil. He's not arguing that, well, okay, let's accept some weaker form of theist. He's just saying, if we accept the God of Christian theism as defined as good, all-powerful, whatnot, then evil will lead to logical contradiction. So the atheist himself is not necessarily committed to arguing against all gods. He's just arguing against a certain conception of God. So in some sense, if Cameron was suggesting that the atheist with the problem of evil is meant to respond to all conceptions of God, then Cameron would have been arguing against a straw man of the atheistic position. What I am concerned about this is his idea, or then the statement, to describe atheism as silly or something which is not to be taken seriously, because that would be wrong, because that, I think there's enough literature on the atheistic side of the debate which is sufficient for us to treat it as a serious, at least philosophical, maybe not existential argument, but at least a philosophical position.
Another big misconception. When I say I no longer take atheism seriously, what I mean is that I no longer take it as a serious contender to theism. Some people think that the problem of evil makes atheism more likely than theism, or that it's some kind of like theism destroying trump card. Let me be blunt. That is obviously false. The existence of evil doesn't magically make atheism the most reasonable explanation of reality. So in this video, I'm going to show you step by step why that's the case, but you guys stick around to the end to see it all sort of laid out, all the reasoning. So if you've ever heard the problem of evil touted as this like ultimate argument for atheism, stick around. You're about to see beautiful visual refutation of that claim. So here's what's coming up. I'm going to walk you through some of the strongest evidence.
Well, I think Cameron's making a jump a bit too quickly from saying, okay, just that evil exists, it means that it doesn't follow that atheism is a good contender. Well, that could be correct in some arguments from the problem of evil, but if you look at Paul Draper's abductive problem of the evil, which essentially says that a non-theistic hypothesis is better explained, or the probability of a non-theistic hypothesis is greater given the existence of evil, or at least our understanding of the distributions of pleasure and pain, than theism given the distributions of pleasure and pain, then I would argue actually that you can't just dismiss it as Cameron does, as not a rival contender. It is a rival contender, and in fact, a lot of people with intuition alone may suggest that Draper's argument is sufficient to lead us to accept atheism as a hypothesis, which is intrinsically, or not intrinsically, but is more probable given our experiences of the world. Now, of course, there are good responses to that with positive skeptical theism and other arguments. Nonetheless, I think that Draper's argument is sufficient for us to demonstrate that the problem of evil is a good reason for us to at least give credence to the atheistic hypothesis given the data provided.
Blow some minds. But before we jump into the first piece of evidence for theism, we need to lay a little bit of groundwork. So in this video, we'll be comparing 3 different hypotheses. 1, perfect being theism, the idea that a perfect being exists with all the omnis, omniscience, omnipotence, omnibenevolence. 2, limited theism. This covers any view where some sort of deity exists but is not perfect. So it's basically like the non-perfect being theism version of theism. And then the third hypothesis is the view, atheism is the view that there are no gods at all. To keep things as simple and as easy as possible for the audience, we're going to start with equal prior probabilities, 50% for atheism, 50% for theism. Then we're going to split theism evenly between perfect being theism and limited theism, giving each
my concern with these is that when people apply numbers in Bayesian theory to the existence of God, it has to really be done in a very massive grain of salt. Like, how do we understand that the priors of atheism and theism are the same? Like, if one accepts the cosmological argument, you could argue that the priors of theism, given the ability that we can have even this discussion to begin with, the priors of theism is intrinsically more probable, etc. Right? So I think, and likewise, the same goes with the atheists. Atheists could say, well, okay, the priors of theism are intrinsically lower than the priors of theism. So I think there's a lot of problems that people can have with any of the numbers that we put here. And at least from my perspective, I would doubt the ability for us to, or deny the ability for us to be able to create any of these numbers or even justify them.
Atheism is the view that there are no gods at all. To keep things as simple and as easy as possible for the audience, we're going to start with equal prior probabilities, 50% for atheism, 50% for theism. Then we're going to split theism evenly between perfect being theism and limited theism, giving each a starting point of 25%. So let's go ahead and
yeah, and then how do we know that the priors of perfect being theism is 25 to a limited being theism? Like that once again seems very arbitrary, and you could say, well, yes, this is for the sake of ease, but even if we say this is for the sake of ease, I don't think we could make the argument or make any definitive argument just based on priors that we just say, okay, this is just easier for us to put these numbers there. We have to have some reason for that.
Software now. All right, first thing we got to do is label perfect being theism, PBT. Whoops, PBT. All right, our next proposition.
I'm not denying that, of course, that is quite a helpful way to look at things.
Theism, we'll call this LT, again, 25%. And then the last one, atheism, A, and we'll give it a probability of 0.5. There you go. So in case you don't know, prior probabilities are just like our starting probabilities before we look at the evidence. So don't stress if you think that these numbers should be tweaked at all. Tweaking the priors is not really going to change the final result, the final conclusion that I'm going to reach in this video. And for any of you sort of nerds out there watching, this is not an endorsement of a naive principle of indifference. All right, with that initial setup out of the way, here are the 3 pieces of evidence for theism we're going to cover in this video. So number 1, the universe is orderly. Number 2, the universe is fine-tuned for life. Number 3, there is consciousness. After we work through these 3 pieces of evidence for theism, then we'll introduce the problem of evil, the argument that
once again, I'm not an expert on probability theory either. I do 19th century continental philosophy, so it's quite far out of my comfort zone. I know a lot of people like to talk about Bayesian probabilities these days in the philosophy of religion. A lot of my apologist friends who I'm on a chat with always talk about Bayesian probabilities. I don't touch any of that. I cannot say I'm an expert on this. But nonetheless, I do think that from a perspective of epistemology, providing these probabilities, providing these numbers have to have some justification as well. And we'll talk about this, and I'm sure we'll return to this topic further on in this video.
Add our first piece of evidence. This one is going to be labeled order. I'm going to explain what's going on the screen in a second. But first, what we got to do is evaluate the likelihood of the evidence given the various hypotheses. Okay, so here's how the evidence affects the probabilities in this case. So under perfect being theism, that's our first probability we need to assign. Order actually makes a lot of sense. Okay, a perfect being would value rationality, consistency, and beauty, all of which are reflected in universal laws. So order allows, for example, for a stable, predictable universe, a framework where life, creativity, and moral growth can flourish. So it's pretty plausible that a perfect being would actually create a universe with consistent order. So let's conservatively, though, let's be conservative here. We don't want to assign too much of a probability here. Let's assign something like 50%. Okay, it's 50% likely, 0.5, that a perfect being would create an orderly universe. In this case, what you're seeing is that half of perfect being theism's sheet is being cut. Okay, this lighter area here, imagine that sheet, that part of perfect being theism's sheet is being cut away. Okay, so we're basically saying that at least half of the possibility space on perfect being theism contains order. Half of it contains disorder. That's what this 0.5 or 50% probability sort of represents. All right, let's move on to limited theism. So limited theism could also explain order, but here's the problem with limited theism. Creating a universe where every object follows the same laws everywhere and at all times is actually a really big deal. Like it seems kind of difficult. A limited deity might lack the power, they might lack the knowledge, or even the motivation to achieve such perfect consistency throughout the universe. So while order is definitely possible under limited theism, it's far less likely than it is under perfect being theism. So again, we're going to be conservative. Let's assign this a probability of 10%. So 0.1, and let's see what happens. All right, so basically in this case, most of limited theism's sheet is being cut away here. Okay, this is the removed portion of limited theism. And we're seeing what happens when we add the evidence of order. This piece is being cut away, and this is all that's left down here of limited theism. All right, let's now turn to atheism. So under atheism, why would we expect every particle in the universe to behave in exactly the same way at all times and in all places? Why not just pure chaos? Some atheistic scenarios might even allow for order, but these are very rare exceptions. Most atheistic universes would look completely chaotic, with objects behaving unpredictably or following, and here's a key point here, they might be just following local, inconsistent rules, right? You don't have to have rules that are consistent throughout the universe.
And here's another thing, right? And I do think Cameron raises, and it's good that he raises, to say that there's a lot of atheistic hypothesis. I mean, Platonism or some form of Platonism would be an example of atheism, which could explain a lot of things in a different way. That this kind of finite world, there is no God, this world pops out of nothing atheism, that's a very different atheism from that. So just as Cameron wants to separate between perfect being theism and limited theism, there are a lot of different atheisms that he probably should try to put in here. And also, one could question whether perfect being theism and limited theism is a good distinction, because there could imaginably be a lot of different forms of limited theism. There could be gods which are good and not all powerful. There could be gods which are all powerful but not all good. There's a lot of things which can come to mind here as well.
Universe, you can have local patches.
And of course, there could be an evil god as well.
Of order. So, but let's be generous again and assign the probability of,
which makes all of this very, very, very confusing in some sense, or very difficult to do. And for this reason, and I hope you're getting my tone or my suggestion here, is I don't really like applying these mathematical approaches to theology, because it's quite difficult to actually do this or actually rationally justify any of these arguments.
Order under atheism at 1 in 1,000 or 0.1%. So let's go ahead and do that now. 0.001. Enter. So in this case, the evidence cuts almost all of atheism's sheet, leaving just a tiny little corner. And actually, we can zoom in here and we can see what's going on. Okay, so this is all that's left here. 0.00005% of the entire possibility space is left over. So when we plug these numbers into the software, here's basically what happens. Okay, perfect being theism sheet retains a significant portion of its space, growing in relative size to the others. Limited theism sheet shrinks, but it's still sort of in the running. All right, but then atheism sheet, just with one piece of evidence, is almost entirely cut away, leaving a fraction of its starting probability. So after normalization, that's what this last bar is on the graph here. Normalized
priors. That's why I think
fine-tuning
argument is very strong, and this is essentially what the
that's where what's left over.
Working towards.
After we've cut away the different possibility space, the different sheets of paper, what's left over is then sort of stretched out. It's stretched out over a probability of 1. Okay, and so the leftover probabilities are just sort of stretched out so you can see them. When we zoom back in here, you can actually see that while atheism is very unlikely at this point after just one piece of evidence, it's still there, right? We can still at least see it. So here's what happens to our final probabilities after we have done just included one piece of evidence. All right, perfect being theism is now sitting at 83%. Limited the thing, but real quick, let me address one possible objection in this section. Okay, some atheists might argue that there are possible atheistic scenarios that predict order, like a multiverse or some kind of like self-organizing principle in nature. And that's totally fair enough. But here's my response to that. Just because there are scenarios that are possible under atheism, that doesn't make them likely under atheism. So under atheism, these scenarios occupy only a tiny sliver of the overall possibility space. The vast majority of atheistic possibilities on that sheet of paper predict disorder, are comprised of disorder and chaos, not the stunning universal regularity that we observe in this universe, where the laws are universal and not local or throughout the whole universe. So even if we grant that such scenarios are possible under atheism, where there are possible sort of possibilities under atheism where there is order, that doesn't change the fact that order is overwhelmingly improbable on atheism or given atheism or under atheism. That's why the numbers that we've assigned here, where atheism accounts for less than 1%, still holds up. And remember, this is just one piece of evidence. Okay, we haven't even gotten to like the big daddy. All right, now let's see what happens when we add in the next piece of evidence. Let's move on to fine tuning. First, what do we mean by fine tuning? Well, it's the idea that the fundamental constants of nature, the numbers baked into the laws of physics. So even if you've got laws, if you've got universal regularity, these are the constants of nature, the numbers that are in there. And these numbers fall within an extraordinarily narrow range that makes life possible. So for example, gravity is strong enough to hold planets together, but it's not so strong that stars are going to collapse in on themselves, right? You've got the right number in that gravitational 1. To put that into perspective, that would be like basically randomly picking one specific atom. Sorts of numbers are so small, a reflection of his creativity and his goodness. But let's be, again, conservative and assign this a relatively low probability of 1 in 1,000, or again, 0.1%. And so in this case, most of perfect being theism's sheet is being cut away, 0.001. All right. Next, limited theism. So a limited deity might lack the power to fine-tune a universe to this degree. All right, he just might not have enough power. Or he might have that power and just not value it as much as an even greater genius might value it. It's far less likely that a being with limited abilities could or would produce a life-forming universe, but still it's not fantastically implausible. We're limited beings and we fine-tune things all the time when we have a chance. So let's set this probability at 1 in 1 million. All right, we're gonna go with a relatively low number here. So 1 in 1 million, let's type that. 0.000001. Okay, so atheism is looking pretty good here. And we start talking about how likely fine-tuning is on atheism. All right, so here's where things get ridiculous. All right, on atheism, there is no guiding intelligence. It's all pure dumb luck. All right, the odds of hitting a life-permitting universe by chance.
I do wonder whether there's any overlap, because the order seems rather similar to fine-tuning in the same way that what he's describing right now seems to be quite similar to order, but just with better, more, at least more justifiable more justifiable. Or sorry, I would like to apologize. I'm not speaking very well because I got off the plane the other day and I'm back from Hong Kong and I'm still somewhat jet lagged. So I do apologize for my impairment of speech. But what I'm trying to say here is, all I'm trying to say is order and fine tuning seems very, very similar. And I'm not sure whether this justifies having those next to each other and whether he should have just stuck with fine tuning, because as he notes, there's more evidence behind the numbers he provides for fine tuning than there is evidence behind the numbers for order, because order seems rather arbitrary in that sense.
Are astronomical. We've already talked about it, but let's be very generous to the atheists. There's a point why I'm doing this actually, because it's going to break my software if I actually put in the right numbers. But let's be generous and say that it's 1 in a trillion or 1 in 10 to the 12th power. All right. So even though that's wildly optimistic compared to the real number that Luke Barnes has calculated, let's go ahead and plug that in here. So 0.00000000001. See what happens. Ooh, okay. So when we plug these numbers into the software, it rules out nearly all of atheism's possibility space and a significant chunk of limited theism's space. And what's left is that perfect being theism comes out way ahead. You know what? Let's go ahead and just zoom in here, see if we can even see the possibility space or the probability of atheism. Let's just try to zoom in, see if we can even see this. And we got to zoom in a lot. Keep going. Oh, there it is. There's atheism. We have to zoom in a lot, but we see it. You know, my software is even just registering it as like a 0 probability at this point, but it's not completely 0. Okay. Actually, if we use the real numbers, atheism slice would disappear almost entirely. Again, it wouldn't be 0, but it would be very, 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 very low. You wouldn't even see it on the graph. Like, it would break my software. All right, let's now add one more crucial clue to the mix before we get to the problem of evil. Let's turn now to consciousness. So for clarity, when I say consciousness, I'm specifically talking about conscious creatures, created beings that have mental states, beings like us who can think and feel and reflect on the world around us. This one is, again, consciousness. We'll type it out really quickly. All right, so starting with perfect being theism, if a perfect being exists, it wouldn't be too surprising to find that this being has created conscious creatures. Why? Well, first of all, a perfect being would recognize the intrinsic value of consciousness. Consciousness is pretty valuable. Consciousness enables rational thought. It enables love, creativity, moral understanding, and good, deep relationships as limited beings create consciousness.
These are just more probabilities.
You're all one. Now, under atheism, consciousness is a wild, entirely different level of improbability of life. Even being generous, the probability of consciousness arising under atheism is vanishingly, that's what I meant to say, vanishingly small. But there, atheism, man, it's as it seems on the surface, and I'm about to show you why. All right, we are ready to add our fourth piece of evidence, evil. Let's go ahead and scroll down here, type in evil. There we go. All right, we're ready to assign our value, our first value. So let's start with perfect being theism. If God exists, why would he allow evil? One plausible answer, one answer that I find really plausible, is what philosophers call the soul-building theodicy. The idea here is that challenges, suffering, and even tragedy can serve a purpose. They shape us into better, stronger, and more virtuous beings. Think of it like going to the gym, right? There's no pain, no gain. Moreover, there are a lot of great goods that can't exist without evil: courage, self-sacrificial love, and the like. A good being might judge that those greater goods should exist to at least a degree, but then he needs to permit evil. There's also been some really intelligent extensions of this theodicy to cover animal suffering. Not that evil is sort of guaranteed under perfect being theism if we have a theodicy like this. I don't necessarily think so, but it's also not wildly unexpected either. So let's assign the likelihood of observing evil under perfect being theism a conservative 10% or 0.1. As you can see here, a lot of the possibility space is being cut away on theism here. All right, so what about limited theism? A limited deity might not have the power to prevent evil, or they might just not care enough to try, or he might, like lots of people, be on the whole very good, but sometimes fall short. Or maybe he just can't see the future, so he can't stop all the evil. There's a lot of possibilities here. Evil under this hypothesis is therefore plausible, but it's not guaranteed. So let's set this probability at 50%, 0.5. Now for atheism, some might think that evil is sort of like a given under atheism. After all, why wouldn't there be suffering in a godless universe with conscious creatures? But let's again be generous to the atheist and set this probability at 1 or 100%. We'll just assume that if atheism is true, evil and suffering is an absolute given. When we plug these numbers, these probabilities into the software, here's what happens. All right, perfect being theism, still overwhelmingly dominant. Limited theism, still pretty tiny. Atheism, still barely clinging to relevance. Like, you literally need scientific notation to even understand how improbable atheism is. But let's raise the stakes. Let's grant the atheist their best case scenario. Let's say the problem of evil is so powerful that the probability of observing evil under perfect being theism drops to 1 in 100,000. So we'll adjust this number, 0.000001. All right, so what happens in this scenario? As you can see, in this unlikely scenario, the odds now slightly favor perfect being theism over limited theism. So we've got a final probability of perfect being theism is about 83%, limited theism about 16%, and then atheism is, again, virtually non-existent. The thing, okay, I don't think theists are backed into a corner that they have to embrace limited theism. In fact, I firmly believe that the problem of evil has very strong answers. I've already mentioned the soul-building theodicy. Perfect being theism, I think, remains the best option on the table. But even in the absolute worst case scenario, the right move isn't to jump ship to atheism, it's to consider limited theism. Having said all of this, if you're still taking atheism as a serious hypothesis about reality, maybe it's time to start asking why.
So all in all, I would like to say that I'm not necessarily disagreeing with the philosophical argumentation that Carbon is providing in his conclusion that the problem of evil does not necessarily undercut theism simpliciter, and that even if one can accept the problem of evil, it doesn't mean that one has to become an atheist. One can't be a limited theist. I'm not disagreeing with that. What I am disagreeing with is, however, number one, his belief that one can just apply these probabilities to the hypothesis of theism versus atheism in a somewhat intuitive way without much justification. I have concerns with that. And number two, I also have concerns about, well, can we actually add up all these arguments together? He takes into consideration fine-tuning arguments, order arguments, and in fact, he could have added even more arguments like cosmological arguments, argument for the resurrection, to increase further the probability of theism over atheism. That is, of course, true. What I am concerned with then is, well, actually, can we even do that? This is the meta question of, is it even justified for us to try to compare all these arguments and add them together? Because one can make a very good argument, I would like to say, is that almost the strength of the problem of evil is independent of these arguments from perfect being theism or these arguments for the existence of God. For example, one can conceivably suggest that the problem of evil is successful. The logical problem of evil, let's take it to the extreme and say the logical problem of evil is successful. And someone else could also say, well, okay, the cosmological argument is true. The resurrection is true. And if that's the case, well, how are we meant to compare these? Does that then mean that the God that we have from the logical problem of evil, or I mean, the God that we have from the resurrection argument is in some ways different from the God from the problem of evil? How are we meant to balance them? How do these fit into the whole picture? I think more work has to be done in the grammar of philosophy, as I was talking about with Wittgenstein, and has more work in the grammar of philosophy of religion has to be done. And also we need to understand actually what do we mean by these cases. And ultimately, I feel rather uncomfortable to say, well, okay, just because the probability is very small from Cameron's calculations, then that we must not take atheism very seriously. Likewise, I think even if you do grant all his arguments against atheism, it still doesn't seem like we should just dismiss atheism as if it's silly or that we shouldn't take it seriously, because the reality is there are a lot of good arguments for or against the existence of God, which do or potentially change the nature and essence of one's faith, especially if we go back to the first context about how all of this fits into an almost existential dialogue with someone about the existence of God. What does that mean? Well, one can suggest that the problem of evil still has that weight there, even if it is wrong. But even if we say that, okay, let's dismiss this idea where Cameron gets everything right, and let's say that, okay, let's face it from the very beginning and say, okay, we have the problem of evil, we have God, where does that leave us? I would say atheism still has a strong credence, not necessarily because it has good arguments for atheism, but just that there are some problems with arguments for the existence of God, which do exist. But also, not only are there arguments potentially with the arguments for the existence of God, there are also suggestions which do support an atheistic hypothesis as a reasonable alternative, not necessarily the true alternative or the necessary alternative, but just to say that the world we experience may at least give some explanation to atheism, for example, Paul Draper's abductive argument of evil. And finally, all of what I've just said is completely independent from the fact of why I made this video. Why I made this video is a result of a growing trend of what I would like to label clickbaity and polarising, unnecessarily polarising videos on Christian YouTube platforms. When we see videos like, oh, why is atheism silly, or why I don't take this serious anymore, or as I did in a small interlude between the two videos, oh, Alex O'Connor's embarrassing debate with Cliff and his son, I think called Stuart. You look at that and you're like, well, what is the goal of these videos? What is the goal of these titles? Does someone look at these videos and think this is a good witness for Christianity? This is a good witness of sound and humble philosophical dialogue where we're searching for the truth? Or are these attempts at just saying, oh, I want to have a game of one-upsmanship where I want to say, oh, due to these arguments, I'm better than you. I'm trying to bash the other argument to the ground. Oh, that's just silly. That's horrible. That's just an embarrassing expression of this person. Why do we need to do this? And that's why I'm making this video is really to say, well, all right, you could grant all the arguments. You could say, well, okay, atheism is wrong. It's incorrect. But do we then have to say, oh, atheism is silly? Oh, why I don't take atheism seriously? In the same way that I think I turn to Marxism or communism, and I think, well, yeah, the arguments for communism is just so horrendously horrible that I don't think any serious person could accept that. But nonetheless, I wouldn't come out here and say, well, or all communists, all Marxists are stupid, or all Marxists are embarrassing, or yada, yada, yada. That's not how I'll go around doing things. I would say, well, these are some of the problems of Marxism. I would like to invite you on to debate on these principles. But I wouldn't necessarily then go on and just start slandering the opposing camp or the opposing beliefs. Because the goal, I think, of philosophical dialogue should not be an attempt to destroy the opposition, but rather to try to bring us together into a dialogue to bring us closer to the truth. And that's why I have great respect for Alex O'Connor. And when I was a younger kid, nowadays I just spend my time on YouTube watching football and movie reviews. But back as a kid, when or maybe like 5-6 years ago, when I actually watched YouTube and this kind of theist kind of dialogue or Christian YouTube, I disliked a lot of people on this platform because I thought none of these people actually have any sincerity towards searching for the truth. None of these people have any sincerity of trying to get towards further knowledge, to develop myself, to actually kind of challenge my own views and try to get closer to truth. I thought Alex O'Connor is a very good representative of that. And I also thought that Capturing Christianity, Cameron in the past used to make really good videos about interviewing professors, engaging with opposing views, and I had great appreciation for that. But then more recently, I just had more concerns or just more questions, let's just say, about, well, are we still trying to hold on to that kind of kind, friendly dialogue, or have both the atheist and theistic side kind of just fallen into this realm of clickbait? And I think that's a real concern. Now, of course, I don't want to sound as I am being overly condescending to this. I understand why people might be making such choices, why people might be titling their contents in a rather clickbaity way. I cannot say I'm completely unguilty of this. If you look at my own YouTube channel, you could probably see some areas where I used to have a bit more clickbaity content, or titles at least. I know my contents was very rarely clickbaity, but I did have more clickbaity titles. Let me bring up on some of my old channels. Where's Philosophy for All? I'm not aware, or well, I'm not unaware of the fact that this could lead to more views for myself. For example, I look to my videos, and you could probably look at this old series, which was titled Oxford Conservatives Talks. There was Oxford Conservatives Talk Veganism, Oxford Talks Countryside, Oxford Conservatives Talk Promiscuity, blah, 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 blah. That used to be titled Oxford Conservatives Talk Pride Month. And inevitably, they got more views than they do now. I've changed the titles on them because I don't think that that's good. It's a point of self-reflection. And I realized I should change the titles to them. And you can notice that the views are indeed decreasing. But I thought it's better to be true to myself. But once again, for someone who does this for their livelihood, instead of me, where I just do this for a bit of fun to share my ideas with you, this is not where I get my money from. I'm not reliant on this. In fact, I get absolutely, basically, I run this YouTube channel on the loss each month. Despite that, I can see why someone who does have to make a livelihood off the YouTube platform would fall into clickbait, because at the end of the day, for YouTubers, views means money, clickbait means views, non-clickbait means no views, that means non-clickbait means no money, and therefore no money means no livelihood. There is a problem. For the same reason, if you look at YouTube channels which tend to be more intellectual and academic, they get way less views than the big Christian channels like What Do You Mean, Capturing Christianity, and stuff like that. You look at Majesty of Reason, who I'm actually having on my channel very soon. We get less views. Now, I'm not saying that's because I'm necessarily, the only reason I'm not getting good views is because I'm not making clickbaity videos. That's not true. I know there's probably a lot of flaws with my YouTube video making skills and my presentation skills. But nonetheless, what I'm trying to say is, well, when you actually have a livelihood on the line, there's a reason for why people might want to make more clickbaity and more polarizing videos, because let's face it, they will get more views. If I tried to make this channel very clickbaity, I could title all my videos, Oxford Christian destroys blah, 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 or Oxford philosophy theologian destroys or rebukes, whatever. And I could probably pull those off for quite a long time and blow this channel up. But at the same time, I don't have a livelihood to depend on this channel, and therefore I'm just doing this for a bit of fun. Whereas people like Cameron Bertuzzi have to do this as a livelihood to make money for their family, and therefore there's a good reason for why they will do it. I'm not blaming the person or blaming their choices. I'm just saying, I think if we see Christian philosophy and Christian YouTube carrying on in this direction, where more people are making Christian YouTube and atheist YouTube their full-time income, well, I think this problem would only grow more in the future. Hope you've enjoyed this video. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I know I've perhaps not been the most coherent out of all my videos in this video. I got off a plane yesterday morning at 6 in the morning. I'm completely jet lagged. I woke up at 4 a.m. in the morning not knowing what was going on. So yeah, I'm sorry for not being the most concise and clear in this video, but I hope you understand the sentiment of this video, and I hope you've enjoyed this video if you've watched till now. Once again, if you enjoy this content, make sure to share it to your friends or any of these videos. I'm very looking forward to what we're having in this upcoming month or two. I'm interviewing loads of scholars on Heidegger, on Edith Stein, on anti-theodicy, talking with Joe Schmidt. A lot of things are coming out on this channel, so I'm really looking forward to that. Make sure you're staying tuned to this video, and I'll see you soon. Have a good one, and God bless.